morning, everyone. Good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our program this morning. My name is Karen Tucker. Welcome to the Churchill Club. This morning's program is called Leadership in the Age of Transparency, and we have an impressive panel of speakers to share their experiences and insights with you. With us are, of course, Charlene Lee, our moderator, Peter Blackmore, Gail Becker, Anthony Wood, Gary Bloom, and John Hamm. Welcome all of you, and thank you very much for being here. John Hamm does need to leave a few minutes early this morning, and so you'll see him hop off the stage when the time comes. I would like to thank Edelman for their sponsorship and making this program possible. Please help me thank them now. And I would also like to acknowledge our Prime Minister members in the audience today. They are Airfoil PR, Cisco Systems, Microsoft, SAP, Silicon Valley Bank, and Yahoo. Welcome. A few brief announcements. Our upcoming programs are listed in your printed programs today, so please take a look. And for those of you who are less familiar with the Churchill Club, we are a nonprofit, member-supported business and technology forum. We have 7,000 members. We're celebrating our 25th year, and every year we offer about 40 great programs that look at what's new, what's next, what's not known around topics in support of innovation and economic growth. So we hope you'll consider participating and joining us. And then finally, you will find Twitter codes in the printed programs this morning, so if you're tweeting, please do use #Churchill Club. And let me now turn this over to our moderator, Charlene Lee. Charlene is well known as the founder of the Altimeter Group and as co-author of the critically acclaimed best-selling book, Groundswell, which was named one of the best business books in 2008. Her newest book is the New York Times bestseller, Open Leadership. Charlene is a foremost expert on social media and a consultant and independent thought leader on leadership, strategy, and much, much more. And in her downtime, at one point, she confessed to me that she indulges in two seemingly opposite passions, Japanese logic puzzles and Survivor. Is that still true, Charlene? Yes. We're pleased to welcome her back to our stage. Please welcome Charlene Lee.
Thank you. So if anybody wants an inside scoop on Philip, if they're watching Survivor, talk to me afterwards. All right, so we have a fantastic panel. I'm going to have them introduce themselves very quickly, and then we'll get into the content of the program. So Peter.
Good morning, Peter Blackmore. I'm CEO of ShoreTel, and I joined that company in December. And it's great to be in a company that's growing fast and hiring a lot of people every quarter in the Valley and elsewhere. Prior to that, I was CEO of a company based in China. So I lived in China for 3 years, and I asked McKinsey once how many Westerners had actually managed a Chinese company, and it's less than that number, less than 10. So a privilege and a huge experience. And before that, Executive Vice President in Compaq and HP. And as you can tell from my accent, appropriate to be at the Churchill Club this morning.
Yes. Gail?
My name is Gail Becker. I'm the president of the Western region for Edelman and chair for Canada and Latin America. I've been at the company about 11 years. Prior to that, I spent time in the entertainment industry and much time in Silicon Valley on the launch of the DVD format. And prior to that, I was worked in the Clinton administration, and I was a journalist.
Great, thank you. Anthony?
My name is Anthony Wood, and I'm the founder and CEO of Roku. We make, I guess we're a classic Silicon Valley venture-backed company. We make internet TV streaming players, so playing Netflix and Hulu Plus and Pandora and Revision 3 and Major League Baseball and that kind of stuff on your TV over the internet. You know, we're growing pretty quickly. We're about 100 employees, $45 million in sales last year, and this year probably tripled that, around 130 million. And then before that, I founded a couple other venture companies, Replay TV, where I invented the DVR, and before that, a company that was bought by Macromedia that made the core technology in what's now known as Dreamweaver, that's now owned by Adobe.
Thanks.
Good morning, I'm Gary Bloom. I'm the CEO of eMeter. We do essentially the leading software for the smart grid. So at the heart of all the smart meters and Knowing that we're in the PG&E service territory, I'll point out that they're a prospect, not a customer. And had they used the right software, we wouldn't be talking about them today. So very, very interesting and challenging industry. It's new to me. I've only been in this particular sector, in this particular company for a year. It's an industry that's really going through a transformation from the dark ages of technology. So where we've got on one extreme the latest and greatest, in this case, we're just trying to modernize old mainframe systems into modern tech. And my history is I spent 5 years at Veritas as CEO, and before that I was 14 years at Oracle.
Good morning. My name is John Hamm. I'm currently doing a lot of CEO advisory work. I just published a leadership book called Unusually Excellent at Wiley. I teach in the business school at University of Santa Clara and Santa Clara University. And prior to that, I was in venture capital for about 8 or 9 years with 2 funds. And previous, an executive in the Valley. I was on the founding team at Brocade, founding team at Adaptec, and have my own company called Whistle, which got acquired by IBM.
Okay, great. So thank you. So you can see a very, very diverse and very experienced panel that we have today. So the topic we have at hand is, what does leadership look like in the age of transparency? And apparently, transparency is all the rage right now. You have WikiLeaks going on, where people from outside the company are finding people inside to tell them all these secrets, posting it up. You have employees constantly talking about what's going on internally, customers talking to each other. It's pretty hard to hide anything in this world now. So how do you lead effectively in that space, where traditionally, you've always had the privilege inside companies to kind of keep things somewhat private so that you can work things out before things go out there. Can't do that anymore. So how do you lead in this world of transparency? And I just want to give a quick example of this. How many of you have seen the new Domino's ad where the CEO goes on and says, our pizza's terrible? Anybody seen that? Has anybody taken that challenge and tried the pizza? Okay, no one has really done it. But what did you see? What did you think when you saw that ad? It's pretty different for somebody to get up there and say, you know, we know that our pizza isn't great. You're just getting it so you can feed kids, hungry hoarder kids in 30 minutes. And we're not going to stand for this. We're going to try to turn it around. So when people see that, it's putting out a stake that says, companies, you know, you're going to have to admit what's going wrong, try to fix it, and put it out there again into the hands of the consumers and your customers to have them be the final judge. So it's interesting, again, in this age of transparency, also where trust is built. And it was interesting with the Edelman trust barometer that came out, really showed a significant jump in one particular area this past year, in that CEOs really saw a tremendous increase. Now, they had a huge decrease over the past 2 years, but also regained trust in the eyes of customers in terms of them being credible, trustworthy, almost a 19% gain, I believe. So in this world where the CEO is oftentimes seen as the key and most trusted spokesperson, how do you establish trust in this space? So I'm going to start with the first question for the panel. What challenges do you typically see when transparency is out there? What challenges does transparency bring to your ability to act as a leader for your organization? So I'm going to start with you, Peter.
Good. So I think I'd answer it in this way. Some things have changed a lot. And what's changed a lot in the last few years is the speed of communication. You can't hide anything. You've got to be out in front of it. So what hasn't changed is that really was the tenet which you should have been doing all the time. If you're a CEO and a leader, if there's bad news, you've got to be out in front of it. You don't want your employees or your customers learning about it after the fact, because that destroys trust. If there's good news, it's a little bit easier, but you have to explain why and what to do about it. And you also have to make sure everybody in the company absolutely understands the direction and the strategy you're going on. And you've got to do that personally. You can't assume it'll be done by email. You can't assume it'll be done by reading a PowerPoint. That's the worst possible way. You have to get out and talk to them individually as much as you can. Difficult in a larger company, but there's still no substitute for enabling that. And the last point is you've got to make sure that the middle managers also communicate that message. Because often through no fault, it gets to the executive team, gets stuck later down, and then you suddenly wonder why people aren't on board, don't understand things. So you've just got to get out in front of it, and it takes a huge amount of personal effort to communicate, and communicate.
I think I would narrow it down probably to 3 challenges, although some of them maybe are just complexities and not necessarily challenges. So the first one, I think, would be not only do you have to share what you, the way that you are moving forward, but you have to share the reasoning behind it. You have to give much more context. It's not just what you say anymore, it's how you say it and what is your rationale. I think the second thing is that you also have to familiarize yourself with all the information that your employees have, because employees have a lot more information. They don't just get their information from CEOs anymore. That used to be their only source of information, and now what they do is, and rightly so, is they counter-check what you are saying with the information in the world around them. And so I think it's very important for leaders today to make sure that they are accessing the same information. And then finally, and I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this, I think one of the biggest challenges, and certainly for me personally, is the challenge between trying to maintain some semblance of a line between a personal life and a professional life. So I remember when I first got my Facebook page, and everybody at work wanted to be my friend, which was great, and certainly better than not wanting to be my friend. But it also presented challenges, because the reason through which I might have initially sought a Facebook change now made it much more work-oriented, and I had to, and we all have to continuously balance you know, how we draw that personal and professional line.
Well, I guess, so transparency, you know, it really affects our business, both in terms of how we communicate with customers and also how we communicate with employees. So with customers, you know, for example, when we added reviews, real-time reviews to our website, our sales increased significantly. So, you know, there's a lot of data about our product, and as long as the product is good, it sells really well. And the more data we can expose about our product, you know, with reviews and forums, and you know, the better it sells. So in that way, it's an amplifier, I think. Whereas you know, before, customers just relied on third-party reviews. Now they can get reviews from other customers, and that's affected our sales a lot. In terms of employees, you know, all the tools, I think, that provide transparency are sort of I mean, we all know this, they're sort of a two-edged sword. I mean, we have, you know, email, we have meetings, we have lots of ways we're transparent with our employees, but I was just going to tell you, email especially, I mean, there's a lot of talk about social, but email still, I think, is, you know, the biggest way people communicate, and it is, you know, it's very dangerous, you know, you know, whenever there's a lawsuit, email comes up. But, you know, I sent an email to my banker last week, asking him for a loan, a home equity loan, or a loan for some reason I'm not going to go into. But anyway, it turns out my banker has the same name as one of my employees, and the email went to my employee asking him for a loan, and he replied that his financial advisor advises him against giving me a loan. So,
did you get it?
Well, the banker was fine with the loan, but the employee wasn't. So that was kind of embarrassing.
Talk about personal and professional, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's actually very funny, because I had the same thing with sending a note to one of my board members that went to one of my employees instead. So very similar situation. So you do have to use that tool carefully. You know, on the subject of transparency, I'll just build on the themes rather than repeat any of the themes, because I'm in general agreement with them. I think with social media and with all the forms of electronic communication, you do have to kind of over-communicate in a funny way. In other words, anything you want to get out there, you're far better off putting it out there yourself than depending on somebody else putting it out there. Because one aspect of the whole social media, one potential aspect of it's not always, is that it's very anonymous, and everybody has an equal voice. So you can talk all day long to your employees, but if your employees are out in forums or message boards or Twittering or whatever, if they're not repeating the messages or they don't have all the information, then you have that potential that you get an immediate disconnect. It goes right back to the trust issue, and if you have a disconnect and there's multiple stories about the same thing from a company out in the world, you really do have a serious issue around trust building up. So from my experience at this stage of the game, I find myself, as social media continues to become more popular, having to communicate a whole lot more of the details, because otherwise people will go and make them up. And the last thing I want my employees doing, and the last thing I want the press doing or anybody else, is filling in the voids with what they can find elsewhere. In other words, you know, do you really want a Yahoo Groups or a blog somewhere to be the filler for the details of why you said what you said? I think you're far better off filling all the gaps yourself and controlling the message. So, you know, from my lens of it, on one hand it changes everything, on the other hand it doesn't change anything. It's just that you have to be much more thorough and you can't have gaps in your communication.
Great. So being at the end of the panel, I usually get to just confirm everything that's been said right down the row. But I mean, starting with what Gary said, I think I'd like to believe that the increase in trust is because we've just become more trustworthy. I'm not that hopeful about it. I think the truth is that transparency is a horse out of the barn. And anybody who thinks they could have sort of had their own private world or their own private data or their own private communications or their own private anything, I think everybody who's tried that over the last handful of years and done it with anything less than honorable intent has eventually been taken to the woodshed. So I think what leaders have realized is that I have no choice. I have to lead in a transparent world. I have to lead as if everyone knows what I'm doing all the time. And as a philosophy, I think that's working. You know, Peter started out and said, hey, I think that the leaders of organizations need to see themselves as chief communications officers. You know, I mean, that's a second title that every senior leader of an organization has, is I'm in charge of communication. And the context of it's incredibly important. I mean, this has been a sort of a theme down that we didn't rehearse this, but you'd think we had. But, you know, the chief communications officer, the importance of context, you know, giving people the reason why things, at least, you know, starting the debate about why that's occurred. My experience in working with leaders and teaching leadership and writing a book is that when people don't know why something's happening, they get very anxious. And as Gary said, I'd much rather fill in the context as a communicator than I would leave it to people to invent their own ideas. Because most of the time, if someone invents their ideas, they're going to do it from fear instead of from information. So I think this theme is really present in today's leaders, which is communications a frontline activity.
That's great. And I'm going to go and do some follow-up questions here, but we are going to take questions halfway through and then come back for more conversation. So I hate it when you have to hold all your questions to the end. So just be prepared. If you have questions, be thinking of them. So I want to go back to something, John, that you mentioned about, you know, this is something that you really have to think very deeply about, the time commitment that it takes. Not only just time, but sort of the consciousness. Have you seen, again, in your teaching and the work and the research, you see a lot of different things from your position, that the leaders today are acting personally very differently. And I'd love to hear from the leaders also your ideas of how you are changing the way you have led personally. So again, this is voluntary.
I'll do a quick one on what I mean, I'm doing it more from observing patterns of large numbers of leaders. I mean, that's where my data comes from, is looking at patterns of success and failure in 50 to 100 leaders. And I think it looks like it takes a lot more time to be in communication, but the truth is it takes a lot more time if you're not. So it's one of the most highly leveraged activities you can possibly have, and I think the tools make it that way, right? It's a measure twice, cut once kind of world. If you see yourself as responsible for the communication, then you see yourself as spending the time to get that right, then the leverage in getting it out, the tools help. So I think that, you know, it's kind of one of those things, I can't afford to spend so much time communicating. My view is you can't afford not to. So I think there's enormous leverage in leaders investing the time in communication. And while many things have changed, especially the tools, the one thing that hasn't changed is the quality of a personal leadership relationship, no matter how it's formed.
Can I challenge one thing you said, which is, and what I heard you say at least, is that, you know, leaders have really changed to earn this trust. I would actually argue, I don't know that leaders have changed that much. I think just what happens is handled differently today than it might have been years ago. Because years ago we didn't have the internet. We've always had, in Silicon Valley in particular, this, what I call kind of the CEOs that blow themselves up. The guys that do something they shouldn't be doing, They do something either in their company or in their private life. And historically, those things just went away quietly. Right. Well, contrast that to the HP situation. You know, nothing quiet about the HP situation in a way that blew up and spinning out of control. But still in the private company world, I can tell you, having looked for quite a fair amount of time and looked at a lot of private companies and played in the private equity world and other spaces, what I can tell you is there's still a lot of CEOs blowing themselves up and a lot of leaders. It's just that we don't always know about it. And one of the things that's happened is boards are now very quiet if they can get away with it, because they know if they say anything, it's going to broadcast out to the world, and it's socially interesting in the news, so it's going to be front page news. And it's going to come right up, and especially with the context of the HP story, where you have a big, visible public story, the press would have a field day on everybody's like that, and how often does this occur? So the private company world really does vary this. So I'd actually challenge the premise that somehow they've improved. I think the number blowing themselves up percentage-wise is probably about the same.
I actually agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily the improvement. I think it's, you know, what's happened in the world around us. And it's interesting because, yes, you know, according to the survey, you know, trust in a CEO in the US did increase by 15%, and that was probably, I think, the only one of the credible spokespeople that did increase. But when you look at CEOs in the BRIC countries, the trust is like in the 80 and 90%. So if you look at, you know, from a global perspective, trust in the CEO in the US is not where it is in many other parts of the world. And I think one of the reasons why it did go up by so much in the US is because we came out of an economic crisis where people are really looking for authority and credibility, and I think that really helped to push the numbers up that they're looking for it, and I think it's up to CEOs today to live up to the promise.
I would actually tell you that it's that trust issue is also cyclical. Yeah. Because I remember selling back during when the Enron crisis broke and all that, walking into, and it is different globally. I remember walking into a major financial institution in Germany, and the first question that they asked me, the CIO at the time said, he said, well, seems like all American companies are pretty crooked. What have you done wrong lately? and I took a little personal offense to that. Yeah. And my response to him was essentially, I'm just curious, is every time somebody walks into one of your bank branches, do you assume they have a gun and they're going to rob you? Or do you assume most people are there to conduct legitimate banking business? So why do you think it's okay to ask an American executive whether he's a crook when he walks in the door? And it was a contentious way to start out a relationship. Needless to say, I didn't get that order. Wow. And I was okay with not getting that order. But it just points out the difference globally and the view when you're looking from the borders outside into the U.S. as to how they view the U.S. CEO culture from a trust perspective. And some of that is communication related. Go ahead, Peter.
I'll build on that. You also have to ask, why do we lose the trust? It's one thing to rebuild it. We're probably back to where we should be or thereabouts, but we lost it through a lot of self-inflicted wounds amongst people who shouldn't have done what they did. And that then has a knock-on effect to everybody, which is not necessarily fair, but that's the way of the world. But I think we're getting back to where we should be. And then the comment about why do the BRIC countries do better, rightly or wrongly, they have an extraordinary respect for authority figures. Probably wrongly. Being English, I'll say English, we've had a total disrespect for authority figures. I was growing up.
And well earned. Well earned.
But it's also the success of business. It's also the success of business.
Coincidence or a mystery why that's true. I mean, our disrespect for authority leaders is well earned.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I was making a little bit of a joke about it. But in the BRIC countries, obviously they'll go through that evolution, but historically, authority figures have had a unique place in society. And coming back to your question was, what do you do different? In some things, it's not that different. I try and reach out to people, so I have this thing called Ask Peter. Any employee can email me or voicemail me or blog me and say, I think about this or think about that, and I guarantee to get back to them within 48 hours. And I've done that in the last 2 companies I've in, and it's amazing what you hear. And as long as they understand that you'll treat their information with respect, and sometimes they're good ideas, sometimes they're not, but they always get a reply. And then also just making sure that people really have access to you. And I know it's easy, I know we all say that, but this is just a simple way of getting that access. But if then go out and when you spend time, try and get to know them personally and try and really understand what makes them tick. And making sure that you do it at all levels of the company, not just the executive ranks, which naturally you get access to. It pays back in dividends because you build trust, you build rapport, and they'll tell you what's going on in the company. They'll absolutely tell you what's going on in the company, as long as they trust you.
In our business, what's changed, a lot of stuff has not changed, I don't think, but what has changed is the speed of information that our customers have access to. So when there's a problem with one of our products, I mean, if the product is great, then our sales accelerate a result, but if there's a problem, then everyone knows immediately there's a problem. And unless you have to react quickly. You have to do something quickly. Otherwise, you know, it just blows up to a big deal.
Yeah, so the speed especially is something I've heard consistently across the board. I want to turn it back to the audience here. Do you have any questions that people are just burning to ask? Okay, we got one here in the middle. Wait for the mic.
So listening to his leaders talk about trust, your need for speedy communications, et cetera, really strikes with me. I've been a marketing leader my whole career. So as a marketing leader, whether it's a private company, public company, division of a massive company, what can we do as marketing leaders? Maybe one or two top-level things we should think about that could help our business leaders be more effective as chief communication officer.
Well, I'll take a stab at it in one direction, and then I'll try to address it to the way you asked the question, too, because I look a little bit as what do we not want you to do as well. And I think it kind of makes the point, which is resist the temptation to reinvent or change the message. So with messages being so broadly distributed now through social media, through the web, where everything you say is public, a marketing department that tries to essentially what I call, you know, control the message or change the message because, well, what he really meant to say was, you know, the old standard bridging technique of, you know, try to redefine it, those contrasts just rip apart trust completely because now you're saying, well, what he really said isn't what he said. He said this other thing, and it's like, no, I actually read it. And it's actually quoted, or in many cases in today's world, is actually on video. It's out there in the public premise. We didn't have to worry about that years ago. You could kind of control it to some extent. You could put out a new message through the press, and it could populate back out there. You could clarify something with a press release. By the time you can get a press release out, 1 million people know what you said. And so then you're trying to redefine it. So, you know, so that's one thing. The second thing that I think that, you know, that's a little bit what not to do. What I think marketing departments today can do is work to make sure that all the employees have consistency of what they're saying. Because again, your message gets fractured very easily if you don't have 100% of the people saying the same thing 100% of the time in 100% of the different forums that they communicate in. And so you have to drive that absolute consistency. And my experience is the bigger the marketing team gets, the less consistency you get out of your marketing team. It's very easy to have consistent messages, consistent marketing when you have 4 or 5 people, which is my current scenario, versus marketing, no offense to the 5 or 6 alumni from Veritas here, but when you have, you know, kind of a 100, 200 person marketing team, potentially, consistency is very hard to drive even within marketing.
I think it's one of the ironies in some of the research I've done too, that the more open you get as an organization, the more disciplined you have to get. Yeah. And especially the more transparent. It just doesn't seem to make sense, right? Openness should be like free, and that's absolutely not the case.
What I'd suggest is avoid the spin doctors. Treat them like witch doctors. It's not good. Because if you use the social media, as we do internally, I encourage people to use it. I say, bring it on, because the more open I am, the more they'll understand. And just make sure that what you say is got every fact that you need to get out there and build that credibility and trust. And then the employees will also use the social media appropriately. Obviously, you need to set simple rules like you've done in email and everything else. You expect people to be sensible, assume they are, and then encourage it.
Okay.
Yeah, the marketing communication is now not just done by the marketing departments. In our company, you know, we have a lot of employees that are not in the marketing department that are regularly communicating with our customers through forums and other means. And so keeping them, and they're often junior level employees that are very passionate about the products. And so you know, you have to make sure they're aligned, but not in a way that offends them, because they get offended very easily sometimes when you try and tell them what to say.
Yeah, exactly. There's a question over here. Oh, you have one right there? Okay. And then we'll take these two and we'll go.
Hello, I'm Doug Andre. I just had a question for the panel. One of the things is, you know, being transparent is a really good goal here, so that avoids, you know, things being hidden inside companies. But how do you reconcile being transparent to your outside stakeholders, at the same time comply with the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements of giving information to everybody simultaneously if it has a material effect on the financial reporting of the company? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think you have to make sure the employees understand that any financial information can only be the information that's published. And if they don't follow those rules, then it's a very short conversation with them, because you have to follow those guidelines. But just make sure that people understand, and you can help by that with sharing with them everything you've shared on the earnings call, making sure they understood it, got the details, and just don't assume they've got half of it. Tell them everything.
I actually took a different approach, which is I just assumed all my employees are shareholders. So if my belief is if I'm really disclosing broadly within my company information, that's as close to a Reg FD disclosure as anything. You might as well communicate it publicly. And so anything you want to control, you better not communicate internally or externally. So you can't look at your employee base, especially as companies get bigger. You know, maybe in a small environment you can keep it contained, but in a big company, you really have to think about your employees as shareholders, and you have to think if you're disclosing information to them, you probably need to disclose it broadly. And so I think you really have to kind of think about who the audience is and what you're communicating.
I think it's one of the benefits, too, of having a continuous dialogue of conversation, so that, you know, you're not going into your employee base or your external stakeholders for the first time when something's wrong. You've been going to them consistently, and you've established a relationship. You know, it's interesting because, just to go back to your question for a second, I think, you know, and as a corollary, part of this is really making the business case for it. Companies today, you know, when you ask companies today, or when you ask, you know, as part of our survey, we ask people, what determines a company's corporate reputation? You know, financial performance and a company's top leadership being widely admired is sort of down here. What's up here, in addition to quality products and services, is a company that I can trust, has transparent and open business practices. I think making the connection to a business, you know, making the business case for why this is no longer a nice to have, but a must have, is really important.
Next question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Alan Krepak. It's interesting, one of the summaries for me so far is that the changes in transparency have really been outside in, and so based on media, social media, technology, leaders have made some changes. I'm wondering, to the panel, whether you individually have made any changes inside out, whether you've done any transformation, any development yourself, changed in yourself in the last couple of years in order to build your trustworthiness, in order to build authentic leadership, so that it's really transparent in terms of the way you manage, the way you think about your business and what you communicate, and how you build trustworthy environments.
I'll take that on with regard to the 20 or 30 leaders I've worked with on this problem in the last handful of years. I think every single one of them had to confront the reality that if they hadn't done what it took for them to lead authentically up until now, they had to do it starting now. They had to figure out the reasons why they had resisted or really not embraced the notion of authenticity. So, you know, why would I not give people access to knowing who I am? Why would I not, you know, share with people the truth about, you know, my shortfalls, and be vulnerable and create some relationship? I think in the old days, you know, you just thought, hey, command and control, don't need to do that. You know, I'm the boss, you're not, here we go. And so I think that this has been a personal transformation for a lot of leaders with regard to really having to come face to face with what it takes in them to become authentic, because if not, the results they want in their other people just aren't going to be there. So it's been a painful time for a lot of leaders, at least the ones I've worked with.
But I think a lot of leaders have always been honest with their employees and their customers, and they really haven't changed. Some people I'm sure have changed, but I think you mentioned this. I mean, my style has not changed over the last 15 years. The only thing that's changed for me has been, you know, the mechanisms are so instant. So it's basically, the thing that's changed for me is tactical. You know, I triple check my emails, and sometimes that's not enough. And sometimes, you know, when I read my email 3 times, I make sure that, okay, well, you know, yes, it might get sent to someone outside the company by accident. You know, if that were to happen, you know, would this email be taken out of context? And so sometimes I'll put more information in the email in case that email is, you know, sent somewhere by accident where it's not supposed to be sent. So in my case, it's all tactical changes.
I would agree with that. I think of it as very tactical as well. The thing for me that's changed is I have to communicate faster. Yeah. I can't save something and wait till the next day and say, yeah, I'll pick that up tonight, I'll draft something tonight, I'll send it in the morning, because by then somebody else has likely communicated it for me, and I've already lost control. Yeah. So especially with internal communications, I find if something happens in the company or something going on internally, I have to jump all over it. I almost have to drop what I'm doing. I have to go write the email, and I have to ship it off to the corporate-wide mail list. Otherwise, by the time I get around to it at the end of the day, everybody in the hallways, everybody in the company around the world already knows the information, yep. And I've let somebody else position that information other than myself. And so I like to try to get ahead of it, and I do find I just have to move much, much quicker.
I agree with that. I think it reinforces what we always knew, but it really stresses best practices. And if you don't do what Gary's just said, then you'll suffer the consequences. So the speed has really, you know, reignited in me. I knew this all along, but no excuse now. You have to do it, get in front of it, be upfront, and be very factual.
But you can see in what these guys both said who are running companies that they're acting differently because they see it differently, right? Something changed in the way they viewed the responsibility to speed, the responsibility to be ahead of the message, the responsibility to be the chief communicator. You know, that behavior didn't change till the thought behind it changed. And I think you just heard 2 examples of how the world has had both these guys change their value on speed relative to the consequences of being behind the ball.
I think part of it, too, is knowing who your audience is. So we have a global company that has a lot of millennials in it, and the things that they want to hear from the leadership of the company is different. Even how you talk about benefits or work-life balance. Those are the messages that are really important to them. So figuring out how those play into what you talk about, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I just want to echo the fact that what I heard from John also, in that in working with so many of these leaders, the ones who don't practice good, authentic leadership in the beginning are the ones who had the biggest change to dig. I mean, you have a panel here of very authentic leaders who have been practicing this, I believe. Yeah. And so that was the thing that struck me in our pre-talk. It's like, there's no issue here with this panel. We kind of stacked it.
Being unfair to somebody who's a countryman of mine, don't go sailing with a good oil rig burning. Not a good idea.
That's a good way of putting it. And so this whole idea I find oftentimes when talking to people is that how do you give up control? This notion that you're in control when you're actually not in control. And so that is the biggest mind shift for them. Once they realize they're not in control, then they can start engaging in a very much more authentic way. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to go back to some discussions here.
All right, Jerry Corbett with Red Flag. So it's Friday morning. What advice are you going to give today to the CEO of GoDaddy?
Is he being too
wow.
out there? Anybody want to take that?
Stay out of Africa.
Yeah. I think that the key thing here with GoDaddy or individual leaders in particular, for a certain type of leader, that's the way they have chosen to lead. That is their management style. That's the way that he has chosen to lead his company. I don't think that would be the case for many people, definitely not on this panel. But I think in the same way that leadership hasn't changed, different styles of leadership, depending on the kind of people you're leading and everything. But anybody else want to add anything to it?
No, it's a funny thing to watch, and we've had some discussions in the hallways at work about it, and everybody has a different view of it, but I think the vast majority of the world came out on the disgusting end of the curve on the whole topic, and the question is, and I think the way my employees that I've talked to viewed it is, if you behave that way, well, that's you. And what he's done is he's just put a brand on not just his leadership style, but actually he's put a brand on his own, kind of personal ethics and personality as well. And so my take on it, there's not a whole lot you can do at that point. He kind of self-branded himself. And unfortunately, it's a very ugly brand.
We're going to keep going, and then we'll come back for questions. I want to talk briefly about the other aspect of leadership, which is the people part of it. We touched briefly on that in terms of the relationships with the employees and how that has changed. We talked quite a bit about transparency externally. We touched a little bit on it before, too, in terms of the intense need to be out there connecting with them constantly. And in particular, sometimes it's hard. I think, Gary, you were mentioning that oftentimes that it's anonymous. Especially in this age of transparency, you had to be more transparent, but sometimes they're hiding behind the cloak of not being transparent. And especially where I think one of the toughest things you have to do as a leader today is to establish those personal relationships for retention, because it is a battle out there for talent. So how do you actually do that? It's a very important job not to just set the direction to communicate, but how do you set the relationship, especially when things have to be transparent, but sometimes they're not? It's a kind of interesting contradiction. Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think in some respects, nothing's really changed. You still have to get out there and talk to people. And the one thing that, my view on it is social media is interesting. You talked earlier about kind of different age categories of employees. There's some of us in the world, and I happen to be one of them, that I don't use Facebook. I don't use as much social networking because I value my privacy. My kids are at the opposite extreme. They don't value any form of privacy whatsoever. And so if you look,
don't know the word.
And they don't even know the word if you look across the different age groups. And so in a funny way, when you look at a company, the age makeup of a company has some bearing on how you might communicate as well. But the one thing I'll tell you that I don't think has gone away at all is that need for personal upfront communications, and the notion that sometimes, regardless of social media, regardless of all the new connectivity technologies and the great telephone systems and video systems and social media and how I can use my computer to have somebody's face on the screen while I'm talking to them, all these different things, it doesn't really solve the problem of being there in person with somebody. And so you still have to kind of make the rounds around the world to your employees, to your customers, to your partners, and there's just something about the good old American handshake that is still valued in a big, big, big piece of trust. And so for me, in a funny way, it's a little bit about what hasn't changed as much as what's changed.
I agree with that, and also be a person, a human being. Obviously you're a CEO, and everybody knows that. You need to remind them of it, and get with them in their own environment, because that's a huge comfort factor, not in your office, in their workplace. And also get with them in groups where they feel comfortable with each other. In other words, if it's the engineering team or R&D team, you get that team together, not all the managers, but the people that are doing the work. And relate to them as much as you can. I'm not an engineer, but relate to them as much as you can. Ask them questions, get them talking, build up the dialogue and build up the trust. It has to be done personally. It takes a lot of time, has to be done personally.
I'm sorry, well, I was going to add on that. When I was finishing this book, we commissioned a piece of research of over 1,000 employees of various companies of all sizes, ages, everything else. And the summary of the request from followers was, I want somebody that I can relate to, that I can trust, and that I'm willing to follow. And that sentence, plus or minus a little bit, was over 80% consistent as sort of the expression of demand from a follower. I want somebody I can relate to. So relate is the word that relationship comes from. I can't relate to somebody, it's hard for me to trust them. If I can't trust them, I wouldn't find them compelling. If I don't find them compelling, I wouldn't be willing to follow them. So I think that much of that hasn't changed. The distinction in my mind between communication and relationship is communication does not make for a relationship. It's necessary but insufficient. A relationship's a two-way idea. So in a one-to-many world, how do you create the feeling that people are heard, that they have the other side of that relationship, that you're just not pontificating or lecturing or sermoning to them about a one-way data dump, but rather they have the chance to actually connect with you in some way. And obviously, as Gary said, the bigger your organization gets and more dispersed your organization gets, the more generationally diverse the organization gets, it's challenging. But that's ultimately, I think, what the goal is, to create a sense of relationship. And I think from there, good things happen.
I think you touched on something that's a really important point, because we've talked a lot about, what do we say and how do we communicate and what do we put out there. But I think equally important, if not more important in many ways, is to listen and to ask questions and to hear what they have to say. Richard Edelman, who's the head of our global company, instituted many years ago an employee survey. And the employee survey is done in all of our offices, 52 around the world. And the head of the office, and oftentimes the regional leader or whatever, is in the office while you share the survey results. And some of them are not really nice about the person who's delivering it. But we are all committed to doing that. And I have to say, because I've been in some offices where, being with the general manager, presenting the information, the fact that that general manager is standing up there, bearing their soul, showing the results of, I haven't done a very good job, the trust level and the relationship that is built from that point forward is really quite significant. And so I just think talking and communicating is very important, but listening in many ways is more important.
Don't you find it concerning, though, that in order to get that information or have that educated point of view, it takes a survey? In other words, what is that particular general manager done that says, I don't have a climate where if I'm doing something wrong, my employees feel willing and open to challenge me? And it's something I work on real hard is, as a leader, is try to create an environment where if somebody wants to challenge my thinking or suggest that they might have a different perspective, that you're open to that.
Of course, but it's an anonymous survey, so I think people feel a lot more, I think it's just human nature, people would feel a lot more comfortable participating in a global anonymous survey. I think we have created an environment where people challenge us all the time, just like we encourage them to challenge their clients. That's often what our clients pay us to do. But I think the added benefit of giving them a forum and communicating that we really want to hear what you have to say, we really care about what you think, we want to give you a safe forum in which to do that, I think is
But
really
don't miss what Gary said, because it's brilliant. Trust is not just about honesty, it's about safety. And the truth is that if leaders can create a safe environment, then they lower the perceived risk of honest communication.
That is true.
I mean, the reality about how we all feel about trust is that the safer it is to make an honest mistake, the more willing the more willing we are to swing for the fences. Think about digital photography. In the old days, if you got a wedding photographer and brought them to a wedding, they'd be very careful about the 220 pictures they took because film was expensive. So the cost of a mistake was reasonable. Digital photographs are free now. So the cost of a mistake is zero. And when the cost of a well-intentioned mistake is zero, you get people behaving completely differently. So while trust on one-on-one, we often sort of conflate it with honesty, environmentally and culturally, it's about feeling a sort of a rational risk environment, right? Like, I know the consequences. Something arbitrary won't happen here if I go up to my boss and give him some honest feedback. Right. I won't just walk into, a tree chipper one day by accident in my boss's office. You
might.
Maybe
you want to hear what you have to say.
So I think that this trust notion we talk about it a lot in the context of a one-to-one relationship, but my feeling is it's got even more power as a cultural idea. Mm-hmm. The information gets better, it moves faster, innovation happens at a completely different rate, and people really feel a sense of freedom when they understand that this is not a world of arbitrary consequences.
Sure.
I can manage risk in this environment. I'm willing to take a chance.
We have a very open culture, and no one gives me honest feedback. It's very hard to get honest feedback. So, and also, when you have there's different kinds of cultures. If you have a culture that's high performance, where you will fire people if they don't do a good job, then getting honest feedback is even harder, no matter how open your culture is. This conversation started actually about hiring talent, which I think is one of the most important things I do. So I just want to comment on that for a second. And I've hired great people from Microsoft, from Google, And the only company I've not been able to hire anyone from in the last 5 years is Apple. And they pay their employees crap, they work them hard, and you cannot hire them. And they love working there. And the reason they love working there is not because they're open. They have one of the least open companies in the world. It's because they're Apple and they're successful. And that's been my experience, is the number one thing you can do to hire people is be successful.
I think that's so important because
Trust
trust and integrity are one thing.
poorly.
They don't give them any stock options.
Well,
That's not it.
Trust and integrity are one thing, but passion,
Yeah, passion. Exactly.
passion is what it's all about. And if you can get people passionate about what you believe in, they'll follow you.
Right.
And they'll also be much more demanding of each other, much more demanding of you.
Yep.
And it's a huge, huge attribute.
Right. I want to ask you one last quick question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. What trends do you see coming up in the future? You don't all have to comment on, but anybody have any thoughts? Trends about the leadership, how leadership is going to be different? Things that people should be thinking about. Any trends?
Well, the obvious one, having just talked about Apple, is the consumer is king. And even if you're an organization like us, which is selling to businesses, what's happening in the phone world is that CIOs can no longer dictate what device you want to use, and you have to think like a consumer to make sure your product and systems are as exciting as the consumers want. Otherwise, you'll fall behind. And the other aspect, which again is obvious, but I think we're all still learning, is what's really happening in the BRIC countries. And that's why I went to live in China for 3 years. And no disrespect, but most people in the West don't really understand it. Mm-hmm. And you need to understand it, because my deal was, if I did that, my children learned Mandarin, and I have 2 sons, and one did and one didn't, so 50% success rate. But you've just got to get out there and see it for yourself. There's no substitute.
Anybody else want to comment on any trends you're seeing?
I would add to that China's sort of I get it, it's a huge effect. I also think that the demographic, millennial, sort of generational changes are significant. I'm an old white fat guy, right? So, over 50, trying to relate to people under 25 or under 30, the mindset in that 20 years is non-trivially different. And, my kids think that no content should be paid for, that, their pictures of almost anything are appropriate on Facebook. It literally, and it's not tactical, it's not behavioral, it's philosophical. So I think that as you look out over, a workforce that's 18 to 59 or 65 right now, you're talking about a handful of different fundamental life philosophies and mentalities about leadership and people and community and information and content and what stuff should cost and work ethic and everything else. And I think it's pretty significantly complex as a leadership environment.
Yeah, I'll just have one other quick comment on that and go to questions. I do think that the way that this generation, and it's not just the young generation, it's moving very quickly into the 45 plus area too as well, is that relationships are very real that are being formed in these virtual environments. I just went to a dinner with Padma Warrior, who's the CTO of Cisco. And I was just walking in, it was a group of training women for dinner. And I was walking in, I go, how do you know Padma? And somebody said, oh, I'm a Twitter friend of hers. I met her on Twitter. I'm like, well, that's fantastic. And I go, when have you, how often do you get to see each other? Well, this is my first time seeing her. And when they came together and met and sat, and they were greeting each other like old friends. That was the thing that was so interesting to me, was that these relationships that people form, they're different. They don't replace the face-to-face, but they're very real. And as a leader, I think you have to absolutely master that skill. So we have some questions? Yeah.
Gail, you mentioned some differences in the way you talk to the millennials about benefits, about pensions, and all those sorts of things. Could you give us some examples of how you differ your message to those particular groups?
Yeah, and sure, and let me just clarify. I don't, and other leaders in the company don't necessarily give them different messages, but with the way that we talk overall to the company, I think has just differed as a result. We don't target, messages per, certain group or what have you. But, you know, we've done a lot of, you know, there's a lot of research out there in terms of, you know, how to be most effective. And, you know, one of the things, you know, we noticed very early on, particularly with recruitment, which is equally as important as retention. And actually, you know, now as a company, we're doing a lot of tweet ups and so forth to try and get, you know, the best recruits out there, because I agree with you, it is most challenging. You know, the things that incentivize them to stay, it's not, sometimes it's about, you know, money or title, and sometimes we hear a lot about, you know, mid-level managers or what have you saying, well, they're over entitled. At the end of the day, it's really about work-life balance could not be more important. And they want to have a work life, and they want to work while they're there, but they also want to have a life outside the work, and the lines between the two have really blurred. One of the things that I think that we're starting to see, and we'll see in terms of trends, you know, people working more outside of the office. So that's a big picture in terms of, you know, globally, as these companies expand globally, and people here have to manage more offices, more people around the world, and what are the challenges associated with that. But then also, people, you know, we've increased working outside the office. The notion of telecommuting, we have a lot more people doing that today, because sometimes that's the best talent, and we have to be creative in how we keep the best talent. So how do you lead people that aren't always physically with you, I think is a huge challenge and trend.
Next question.
Hi, I'm John No. I manage the corporate communications team at Brocade. There was a lot of focus earlier about the impact of social media and transparency on the speed of communications, but it occurs to me it has also impacted the volume of amount of information as well. And as leaders, I'd be really curious to find out how you guys manage the sheer volume and prioritizing what's important and, you know, what needs to be addressed first, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking out loud a little bit. There's no magic formula to it, and the difference I feel today than I felt 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago is I do miss things. I can't get through all the emails, and the chances that an email ends up down in the queue somewhere, and you're on the plane cleaning it up, and you're somewhere over the Midwest, and you go, man, did I forget to follow up on that? And you find this email that happens to be 5 days old, but it's 500 down in your queue, and you've missed an immediate thing that needed attention. So, you know, one of the things that I think has come up is there's a lag time, and that's actually creating this exponential volume increase in communication, because then you can actually search by that person's name, and you're going to see 7 more emails on the same topic because you didn't respond quick enough. So to me, it's one of these things where you really can't disconnect, and there's this notion of, you know, you can't take a vacation without your BlackBerry or your iPhone or your iPad. You know, now I can't take my vacation without my laptop, my iPad, my iPhone, and my BlackBerry. You know, and I walk around with all of them going all the time, and there's really, in a funny way, there's no sense of disconnecting. I do volunteer rescue work, so I run the Sheriff's Rescue Team for San Mateo County. We are called out to do tsunami evacuations. Completely different world of communication, because not only were we out in the middle of the night doing evacuations, but one of the mediums to get the message out to the community was the internet. It was the warnings that were coming. One of the guys in our rescue truck was on my iPad. We were following what messages were going where in the community. And at the same time, he's saying, by the way, you just got an email that says important, important, important. And he hands it back to me. You know, and so it's all mixed up, your personal life and your public life and your private life and your work life. These things are all merged together into a massive communication. And I just think it's kind of a good news, bad thing. You're always communicating, you're always available. But the bad news is you're always communicating, you're always available, but you can't get behind. And I think we're forced to be responsive, or we get into basically serious peril of missing something critical.
The best thing, it's very hard, but probably the best thing I do is make sure your staff knows that they need to come talk to you if something's important is happening. So, you know, I could stop reading my email, and I would know that if something important came up, someone would come and get me. They need to figure out what's important to me and what's not.
There's a famous saying from the person called Churchill that, apologize, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long letter. So I mean, I agree absolutely with everybody said, but the other thing I'm trying to encourage my employers to do is don't send me PowerPoint. Try and analyze what you're saying or what you're communicating in a very short space of time. Think about it. Writing is better than putting it in PowerPoint. And if you can't crystallize your thoughts into, you know, a few paragraphs, there's something wrong. Now, it can be more complex than that, I understand that, but I think everybody can help each other by not just giving us a dump of a huge file or armies of emails, because otherwise the problem doesn't get any better. We all have to assimilate and filter in some way, but I think there's a lot of internal learning to use all the tools we've got more effectively.
I agree with you, but I have a concern tied to it. So on one hand, I agree, which is there's also an oversimplification of messages coming in as well. I work in a company where this company, the employees, they love the instant message. And I didn't grow up in an instant messaging world. It's not my favorite form of communication, but my employees love it. And there are lots of complex things you're doing in the business world that don't fit well into an instant message text. And I find myself very often, I was doing it in the middle of last night, you know, where I'm messaging back, and I'm like, well, forget this, and I just push the phone number, and it's like, let's talk about this. It's like, we're debating this complex deal topic for our last Q1 deal, coming up to midnight, and we're going back and forth on contract terms. It's like, you got to be kidding. And so I think we all have to be careful to not fall victim to oversimplification on messaging as well.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I think it's a great question, and it's one that I hear people talking about all the time. On a personal note, I struggle with it every day. I think, and maybe this goes back to your question in terms of, how do we talk to our employees, particularly if we're not in the same demographic per se. And I think part of it is what you say, and part of it is how you say it. And I remember when I travel and go to different offices, I always have a town hall meeting where people can just ask anything openly. Because I think it's really important not only that people are encouraged to ask questions, but that they can do so in front of other people. So nothing. I remember a few years ago, people said, "Do you have a Facebook page?" In front of this was maybe 3 years ago, and I didn't at the time. But I left that meeting and I started one, and I did it because what I realized is even though it may not be my initial gut, instinctual mode of communication, I knew it was important for them. And it's funny because I just had a conversation with my 13-year-old son who said, "Mom, can I get a Facebook page?" This was last week, and just instinctually, without even thinking about it, he said, of course I said no, and he said, "But why not? You have one." And instinctually, without even thinking about it, I said, "Yeah, but mine's for work." Because in my mind, it is a way that I communicate with people who work for me, not necessarily because it's my preferred mode, but because I know it's theirs. And the same with Twitter and what have you.
Yeah. I'll tell you my solution for the volume, because I'm very connected, being the space that I am in. I'm on a very strict social media diet. And I track actually how much time regularly, how much time I spend on it. It's between 15 and 20 minutes a day. This is all the messaging and everything else that I have to do. And I do it on my phone while waiting in lines. So the key thing for me is to know what I will do and what I won't do, and I have a strategy around it. Because it is all about what you decide to spend your very limited time on and what you don't, because that is the strategy. I think we have time for, no, we don't have time. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly. And basically, I think that the key thing here is that when you think about leadership, so many things we heard have changed. Some things have changed significantly: speed, response, the transparency is putting greater pressure on it, but so many things have not. And that's the thing that I think this panel, and also from the research that John and I have done, is that there are some aspects about leadership that are just timeless. And those things will always stay true. So I think it's grounding whatever you do in those timeless aspects of leadership, whatever it means to you, whatever it means to the GoDaddy chairman. It's the important thing that's going to establish you as a credible leader. So thank you very much to our panel, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
One last moment here. We have the we have the ceremonial presentation. So just want to thank our speakers and Charlene. Thank you for sharing your perspectives with us. And as a gesture of thanks, we have for you the stylish Churchill Club t-shirt. We hope you'll wear it with great pride. Thanks again to our sponsor, Edelman, and you have been a great audience. Thank you so much for coming, and have a great day.